Good evening, and thanks for coming. You may be wondering about the similarity in our names. It's because Sigrid is my wife, and so it's my great privilege to be able to introduce her here tonight. And in case you are unfamiliar with her career, I want to just say a few words at the beginning. Sigrid is a person who's accomplished many firsts in her life. The first thing I think of note is that she's the first person to have both a joint law degree and PhD in bioethics in the United States, which I think eminently qualified her for this trip, which is another of her firsts. She's the first Westerner to travel to Iran to see their system of compensated donation for kidneys. She'll tell you about the trip, what motivated her, and what was unique about it, and whether or not Iran really has solved the shortage in human kidneys. So without any further delay, Sigrid Fry-Revere.
I'm not doing this right. Oh, I know why. I'm supposed to take this one, right? Got it. Okay, you can hear me, right? Okay, good. Well, thank you, Bob. That was sweet. I am very happy and excited today, and when I am this optimistic, I like to think that maybe I am the Harriet Beecher Stowe of the kidney transplant world, and that people who read my book will see a human face on kidney sellers in Iran, and it will make a sea change in how the U.S. looks at living donation. For those of you who might not know who Harriet Beecher Stowe is, she wrote the book Uncle Tom's Cabin at the time of the U.S. Civil War, and because of her book, she put a face on the suffering of slaves in the South, and she brought the debate about slavery home to families and people and feelings and what life was really like for them. And that's what I hope to do with my book. I hope to bring home what it is like to be a kidney seller in Iran. So my book is not academic, it's not a polemic, it is a book of stories. My story of discovery and the story of the kidney sellers whom I interviewed. I'm going to do three things today. I'm going to give you a little tiny bit of background on the organ crisis, because without that you don't have a context for the book. Then we're going to see a short book trailer that my friend Marianne Benner made for me, because she does in 3 minutes what I couldn't do in 20. And then after that, we'll go to questions, because it's my experience that that's really the most important part, is to answer your questions about the book and the system in Iran. So what about the history? The history starts really 35 years ago with the development of immunosuppressant drugs that made it possible to transplant one organ from one person into another. The organ that they used was kidneys, and the reason they used kidneys is that we all have two kidneys, and both the donor and the recipient could live with just one. But with this realization that we could save people who needed kidneys and that we could use immunosuppressant drugs to do that, the brilliant scientists and medical researchers said, my goodness, why don't we use cadaver organs? And then the whole development of transplant history really started rolling fast. And we figured out that we could save people who needed hearts, who needed lungs, who needed livers, who needed intestines, just about every other possible major organ that we could get from cadavers, but we obviously can't get from living donors because the living donors need them. But kidneys, then and now, living donors can be fine with just one. Okay? And that's very, very important, because what happened about 5 years later is the Iranian Islamic Revolution. And the significance there is that at the time, Iran was participating in the European Organ Transplant Network. So they were developing, like the West was, their cadaver organ donation. But when the Islamic Revolution hit, they were cut off from the West, in part because of religious reasons. The Quran has some problems with using dead bodies, and because the West shortly thereafter imposed sanctions, and they didn't have the resources, the technology, or the infrastructure to really continue with deceased organ donation. So they decided to focus on living donation. So the simpler, sort of old-fashioned way of dealing with the transplant shortage. And this wasn't as irrational as you may think, because 80 to 90% of people who need organs need kidneys. So they focused on the largest part of the population that needed help, while we focused on everybody at the same time, and we focused on finding the technologies we could to keep organs viable and transport them quickly and do everything we could to get them from cadavers. Now, getting them from cadavers made sense, because why put a living person at risk for a kidney if you can get it from a cadaver? But the important point here is that we went in two different directions. Iran spent 30 years improving its living donor program, while we spent 30 years concentrating on our deceased organ program. Now, if you look at today, there's a real insight you can get from the result. If you need a heart or a liver, better live here. If you need a kidney, be an Iranian. Why? Because in Iran, if you medically qualify to get a kidney, you get one. In the United States, out of the 120,000 people who need organs, 100,000 of them need kidneys. 15 to 20 Americans die every day because they can't get a kidney. And that's not happening in Iran. Now, for the last 10 years, Iran has also started to work on its deceased organ program, and it's slowly catching up. And they're looking to us for a lot of their technology and the developments in that direction. But until I went to Iran, Americans were not looking at all towards Iran to see how to deal with the kidney shortage. I mean, they had solved it, or were claiming they had solved it. And it kind of blows my mind that no one wanted to go. No one believed they could have done it, or they said maybe they were exploiting their poor or doing it, forcing people to donate. And I just said, well, if they're claiming to have solved their shortage, maybe someone should go look. Maybe someone should, see what's really going on. Getting there was not easy, but the book talks about that. And the book also talks about, just the Iranian customs. But ultimately, what it really comes down to is people helping people, and people being willing to donate a kidney the way a lot of Americans do. A lot of Americans donate kidneys altruistically, but only 15% of the population ends up getting, that needs a kidney ends up getting one. So the altruistic donation is clearly not enough. And the only other thing you really need to know is that even if every single American were a donor, we still wouldn't have enough kidneys, because fewer than 1% of the population dies under conditions that makes procuring organs feasible, okay? And the reason is they die too far away from the hospital, or they're too old, or they're too sick, okay? So even if every single American were a donor, that might increase the amount by 10, 15,000 kidneys. And my feeling is, we really ought to take a close look at what Iran is doing. The analogy I like to use is, if you have a neighbor down the street that you really don't like, you don't get along with them, they have different traditions than you do, you can avoid them, no problem. Just, avoid them, stay away from them. You don't have to interact with them. But let's say that a plague hits your street and people start getting sick, and your neighbors are dying, and people in your household are dying, but for some reason, that person down the street, that one you really don't like, no one in their household